Sunday night, trade turmoil. The Prime Minister pitches new alliances in Asia after President Trump terminated talks and raised tariffs.
This is interference in U.S. sovereign matters.
The latest fallout from Ontario's anti-tariff ad campaign.
We've got a number of players in Asia right now. We've, of course, got Treasury Secretary for the Trump administration, Scott Bessent, whose clip you just heard from, referring to some of the moves made by Canadians as the moves of a hothead. We know that the president is there, and we know that our own Prime Minister is on this very important trip to Asia, seeking a new trade deal with Asian partners.
The world watched in disbelief this week as reports confirmed what few thought possible. Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, just turned toward Beijing accepting a new Chinese trade framework that could rewrite the balance of power across the global economy. And the one person most visibly shaken by this sudden move? Donald Trump. Furious, blindsided, and politically cornered, Trump is now facing a new reality he never saw coming. The North American trade alliance he once considered unbreakable may be cracking right before his eyes. And it all started with a war he thought he could win, the tariff war that has now backfired in ways no one could have imagined. When the first whispers came out of Ottawa about a potential pivot toward Asia, few in Washington took it seriously. Trump's advisors dismissed it as posturing a negotiation tactic meant to pressure the U.S. into relaxing its tariffs on Canadian aluminum, steel, and autos. But behind the scenes, something much larger was brewing. Carney, an economist and a strategist by nature, had grown frustrated with America's unpredictability. The constant tariff threats, the abrupt trade reversals, and the looming economic uncertainty had all pushed Canada toward finding stability elsewhere. And that stability, ironically, appeared to come from China, the very nation Trump spent years demonizing. The tension didn't erupt overnight. For months, the U.S. and Canada have been quietly feuding over tariffs, energy exports, and agricultural trade. Trump's aggressive tariff policies, aimed at punishing foreign producers and protecting U.S. jobs, have instead ignited resentment among America's closest allies. For Canada, which depends heavily on cross-border trade, those policies became unbearable. When Trump announced new tariffs on electric vehicles and critical minerals earlier this year, Ottawa saw it as the last straw. Carney's team began talks with Beijing behind closed doors, a series of meetings framed not as a defiance of the United States, but as an exploration of diversified partnerships. Still, in global diplomacy, language can be deceiving. Diversification often means reorientation, and when China extended an offer that promised stability, long-term infrastructure funding, and access to growing Asian markets, Carney accepted. It was a calculated move, one meant to protect Canada's economic future in an era where U.S. politics had become increasingly volatile. For Trump, this wasn't just an economic setback, it was a personal insult. He had long prided himself on keeping America's allies in line through pressure and negotiation. The idea that Canada, of all countries, would move toward China was unthinkable. During a private meeting, one White House source claimed Trump slammed his fist on the table after being briefed on the deal, demanding to know, how could Carney do this to us? From his perspective, it was betrayal, not diplomacy. Trump saw Carney's acceptance of China's trade deal as an act of disloyalty, a signal that even America's closest partners were losing faith in its leadership. And in some ways, they were. Since 2022, the world has been shifting away from the traditional Western-led order. The rise of BRICS, the growing dominance of the Chinese yuan in international transactions, and the increasing frustration with U.S. tariffs have all eroded Washington's economic influence. Carney, always the pragmatist, recognized that the world was changing fast. Canada couldn't afford to rely solely on the United States anymore. His government's acceptance of China's trade deal wasn't about ideology or friendship. It was about survival. Beijing offered something Washington no longer could: consistency, infrastructure investment, and guaranteed access to Asian consumers. While the U.S. was caught up in election year politics and tariff wars, China was quietly building a global network of economic allies, and now Canada had joined that circle. The shockwaves spread instantly. American manufacturers feared that Canada's pivot toward China could disrupt North American supply chains. U.S. automakers, already hit by tariffs on EV components, now worried that parts sourced from Canada could soon be labeled as foreign under new trade definitions. Farmers feared retaliatory tariffs. Energy companies braced for higher costs. And on Wall Street, analysts warned that a new global trade realignment was underway, one that might isolate the United States more than any previous policy. Trump's response was as fiery as expected. He took to social media, calling the deal a massive mistake, and accusing Carney of selling out to the Chinese Communist Party. In rallies, he declared that under his leadership, America would never be pushed around by weak globalists. His tone was defiant, but insiders say the anger masked something deeper concern that he may have lost his grip on America's most loyal allies. Carney, on the other hand, maintained a calm composure during his press briefing. "This is not about choosing sides," he said, his tone deliberate. "It's about ensuring Canada's long-term economic security in a world that is rapidly changing." His words were diplomatic, but the message behind them was unmistakable. Canada was moving forward, with or without Washington's approval. Behind closed doors, U.S. diplomats scrambled to interpret the implications. Was this a temporary realignment, or the beginning of a permanent shift? Could the U.S. afford to alienate Canada further? For decades, American dominance rested not only on its military and economy, but also on its web of alliances. Losing trust with Ottawa could send a dangerous signal to Europe, Asia, and beyond that, even America's oldest friends were starting to hedge their bets. As Beijing celebrated the announcement, Chinese state media called it a historic breakthrough. Commentators framed the agreement as proof that the world was embracing a new economic model, one less dependent on Washington's approval. In reality, the deal is both symbolic and strategic. Canada's exports to China remain modest compared to its trade with the U.S. But this move represents something far more significant: political independence. In a sense, Carney's decision was years in the making. He had watched successive U.S. administrations, both Republican and Democrat, use trade as a political weapon. He saw the volatility of tariff wars, the unpredictability of sanctions, and the fragility of Western unity. To him, the path forward wasn't to choose sides, but to build leverage. And China, with its expanding market and long-term vision, offered the kind of leverage that small and medium economies desperately need in a multipolar world. In Washington, however, the mood was grim. Advisors warned that this could set off a domino effect across the Western alliance. If Canada could strike a trade framework with China despite U.S. opposition, what would stop others, perhaps the UK, Australia, or even Japan, from doing the same? The fear wasn't just economic, it was ideological. For decades, the U.S. positioned itself as the guardian of the free world, promoting trade based on Western values and open markets. But now, that system appeared to be fracturing under its own weight. Trump's team quickly floated retaliatory measures, new tariffs, import restrictions, and even suspending certain trade privileges. But such moves risked backfiring. Canada remains America's largest trading partner, and any escalation could harm U.S. businesses as much as it would hurt Ottawa. Still, Trump's political brand is built on confrontation, not compromise. To his base, toughness equals leadership, and backing down was not an option. Meanwhile, Carney's approval ratings in Canada surged. Many Canadians, tired of being caught in the crossfire of U.S. economic wars, saw his decision as a bold step toward independence. Media headlines praised him for standing up to Trump's pressure and putting Canadian interests first. For a country long overshadowed by its southern neighbor, this was more than just a policy win. It was a statement of identity. Across Europe, leaders quietly observed. They understood what this meant. The West's internal divisions were deepening. As America turned inward, allies were learning to adapt without waiting for Washington's approval. The age of unipolarity, where one country dictated global trade norms, was ending. Beijing, ever the master of strategic timing, seized the moment. Chinese officials highlighted Carney's forward-thinking leadership and hinted at further collaborations on clean energy, artificial intelligence, and green infrastructure. For China, this wasn't just about trade. It was about rewriting the rules of global influence, using economics as a tool to expand its reach. As the story unfolded, analysts began connecting dots. Trump's tariff war, originally designed to weaken China, had ironically driven its neighbors closer together, from Canada and Brazil to Germany and South Korea. The more Washington tried to isolate Beijing, the more nations saw opportunity in partnership. It was a geopolitical paradox that few in the U.S. wanted to admit. The question now is not whether Trump will retaliate, he will, but whether it will make any difference. The trade world has changed. Power has diffused. And in that diffusion, America's leverage has weakened. What once worked tariffs, sanctions, pressure now risks alienating allies instead of coercing them. The irony of this moment can't be overstated. Trump built his political identity on being a deal-maker, yet here he stands, watching a deal slip through his fingers, not because of incompetence, but because the world no longer plays by America's old rules. Carney's acceptance of China's trade framework isn't just about economics. It's a signal to the world that middle powers can choose their own path, even in the shadow of a superpower. And in doing so, Canada has changed the conversation. The United States now faces a difficult question. Can it lead by partnership, or will it continue to rule by pressure? As tensions escalate, both Trump and Carney are preparing for what comes next. For Trump, the challenge is domestic convincing Americans that he still holds the upper hand. For Carney, it's global ensuring that Canada can navigate the fine line between opportunity and overdependence. For China, it's victory, a slow, strategic win in a war fought not with bullets, but with contracts and influence. The world is watching this play unfold, not as a single event, but as a turning point. Because when history looks back, it may see this as the moment when the Western alliance truly began to fracture not through war, but through economics. And perhaps that's what makes it even more powerful. Trump's fury is understandable. His trade war was meant to restore American dominance. Instead, it has accelerated the very decline he sought to reverse. Allies are drifting, rivals are rising, and the balance of power is shifting not in Washington's favor. And yet, for all the chaos, there's one lesson that both leaders might share. In geopolitics, control is an illusion. You can influence markets, pressure nations, and rally supporters, but you can't stop the tide of change. The global order is rewriting itself, and this moment Carney's China move will go down as one of the defining chapters of that story.